A most original and creative talent in our business. Would you welcome Mr. Orson Welles?
Ladies and gentlemen, Orson Welles again, come to call for another visit.
Good evening. This is Orson Welles.
Buck Benny, a two-fisted, quick-triggered marksman who shoots from the hip and never misses.
Well, Joel, again, this is Buck Benny speaking. Welcome to another episode of Orson Welles. We have our friend Terry Phillips with us. John Henderson is with us as well.
Hello.
And Kathy Fuller-Seeley. So we're delighted to have us all here to chat a little bit about Orson and a little bit about this episode. Just to let you know, we're kind of redoing this episode. We recorded it before, and then I misplaced the recording, so we decided we would do it again. And I did it another time by myself before that, so this is a few times I revisited this episode. Anyway, I think we'll go with Terry first, and just to see if there's anything that's kind of stuck out with him in this episode. So go ahead.
Well, I think one thing that's always important with these Orson Welles commentaries, and particularly the earlier ones, is to get a little context. This was September 30th, 1945. It was less than a month after the end of the Second World War. Japan had surrendered on September the 2nd. And so naturally for Orson Welles listeners, the war was very much on everyone's mind. The previous references that he made, because this wasn't his first commentary, but the program just before this included a mention by Welles about some language on the back of a parking garage receipt that said no bailment created here. And what was funny, I think when we talked about that particular episode, I, being the smart aleck in the bunch here, I said, well, I spent a year in law school, guys, and blah, blah, blah. And so Welles apparently heard from a lot of lawyers after that, and he discusses that here. Being always a champion of civil rights, he talks a little bit about a singer named Thelma Carpenter, and she was fabulously popular. But of course, there were always people who had to bring up the fact that she didn't look like everybody else. She wasn't of European origin, she was African American. And so he talks a little bit about her appearance on the Eddie Cantor program. But mostly he talks about things related to the war and the post-war period, particularly with respect to old blood and guts, meaning General George Patton and Eisenhower. At the end of this episode, he mentions a movie that he had just seen, which is called The True Glory. He called it the Eisenhower picture. It was introduced by Ike, but not really so much about him as it was about the heroic actions of those who fought in the Second World War. I won't talk about the bullfighting story yet, because I'm sure we all want to weigh into that, but just a couple more historical points of historical context. The day before this episode was broadcast, September 29th, the Chicago Cubs won the National League pennant. And that didn't happen again for a long time. And the day of this broadcast, Hank Greenberg of the Detroit Tigers, one of my former hometowns, hit a grand slam to bring the Tigers to the American League pennant victory. So it was a big couple of days in sports.
Nice. Excellent. Thank you, Terry. John, anything for you kind of stood out in this one, or that you?
I wonder if this is this before or after the famous incident with Hank Greenberg that started the Jack Benny recurring joke, Greenberg's on third. There was a World Series where he was on third and he didn't run for it. So anyway, I thought, yeah, I don't know if you know when that happened, but
no,
probably
I think this predates that, I want to say, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's always you've got two ways that you can listen to Orson Welles. One is at bedtime, where you're not really listening, you're just letting him lull you to sleep.
Yes.
So that's how I like to enjoy Orson Welles. But if you really sit and you listen to it, I don't like to get into politics too much,
Right.
whether it's modern politics or 1930s or 40s politics.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to listen to where the thoughts of people and the opinions were from this period in history. So I thought that was really interesting.
Right.
But my favorite part, of course, is sitting and listening to the stories. And the story of the bullfighting, thing, I thought was the most enjoyable part of the whole story, especially the sort of the idea of being at a church or a chapel, and you've got the kid who's praying to God for the life of the bull who he loves, and then you've got the bullfighter who's praying to God for his own life, and that's not gonna work well for somebody. So yeah, and then to hear the resolution is also satisfying.
Agreed. Kathy, we'll swing over to you.
Well, I'm always glad to get to revisit these episodes, and like John, and Terry, I'm always so impressed to get this snapshot of life at the very end of the war. As I said, the way my undergraduates understand it is that the whole all of America just goes to Disneyland, even if it hadn't been built yet. If you just think about the celebrations of the war being over, without all the thinking about all the tremendous number of things that were happening, Europe starving that he mentions, this and that. And I was curious if anybody has an opinion. Does the story of Bonito the Bull relate to what's going on in late September 1945? Is it the fate of the world that is in balance here between the little boy and, or is it America that we're, celebrating, coming out of the war? I would just be curious if anybody cares to make a connection, because it's probable that somewhere in there Orson did. So.
Yeah, Orson usually
Blew my
did.
mind.
Yeah. Orson usually would connect those things up, and when I was listening to this, I was thinking the same thing. I was going, okay, what does this relate to? Why is he sharing this? And I don't know, other than the fact he could not have a connection, in that he's been talking about bullfighting in general, and then this could be simply a story that he enjoyed about bullfighting, and so shared it that way. I'm not sure, but Terry, you're usually our guy who can connect things together, and I'm going, I don't know what you connect to that.
To paraphrase Sigmund Freud, sometimes a story is just a story.
That's great.
But it's a fine question, Kathy. I don't know either, and I wouldn't be shocked to discover somewhere in his archives that Orson Welles did have some metaphorical thoughts in mind for this story, but I don't know. Certainly was not obvious to me.
No. Mm-mm.
The ongoing mysteries of Orson.
Well, the one that I wanted to comment on just a little bit is apparently a big deal was made about Eddie Cantor having a black female singer on his show without saying she was black, and just introducing her as the singer. And of course, the bit Orson talks about in here is how he was impressed with Cantor's response, that Cantor said, well, I've never introduced a white singer as, oh, this is my white singer. Having said all that, there's a couple strange things about this. One is that I feel like on the Bing Crosby show, he'd had a number of black performers and would continue to have a number of black performers and never introduce anybody as black. I have a great black singer here that I thought I'd bring out for you. I mean, he never says that. The only thing I wonder about is, did Bing Crosby's singers happen to sound more black than this Eddie Cantor singer? In that, when you have Satchmo come on and sing for you, people know what they're getting, and they don't, and they understand it. And then a number of the black as I think of all the different black performers that I've heard on Crosby's show, it's pretty obvious that they're black. They have this, their style is very much makes you go, oh, that must be a black singer that's singing this, even though you don't know the singer. Maybe in Cantor's case, I don't know. All I can assume is that maybe it was a black singer that sounded very white, and so you're going, well, oh, we didn't know she was a black singer, and maybe people got offended. I don't know what the deal was there, why they made a big deal of that. That's one. Two, for me, is the best way to try and integrate black performers acting like they're not black performers and just treating them like they're white, or just treating them like they're like you're colorblind? Or would it be better to say, we have this wonderful, I don't know if you bring in a black singer or something. I don't know if you, because you're trying to get the audience to realize, I would hope, that it's okay to have black singers on. It's okay to have, you want to have all cultures represented. And if you have a great singer, it shouldn't matter what nationality they are or what race they are. But I don't know if it's interesting to try and think of what would be the best way to do this. And I don't know what the best way. Certainly Bing's way of doing it was just to, hey, if I can find a great singer, I'm going to have them on my show. It doesn't matter. And just never, I don't think he ever touched on that issue. Now, he would joke around with the singer, and the singer might themselves mention like performing with other black performers and so forth. I mean, it may come out in their kind of banter back and forth. I don't know if on Eddie Cantor's show, if there was any banter between he and the singer, or whether she just came out and sang and then that was it. I'd have to go back and try and dig up that episode, which I probably should do now that I think about it. Go ahead, Kathy.
Daryl, you're so right. And this is worthy of research for like an article, but this was happening in so many places that it's never been pulled together. In 1945, Butterfly McQueen was on Red Skelton's show as the president of his fan club, and it was not said that she was African American.
Right.
And she did that in response to when she'd been on the Jack Benny show. She had to play Butterfly the maid, was a heavily racialized character.
Yeah.
That Butterfly did not care for the stereotypes that were being put on her. So and at the same time, Eddie Anderson is trying to make the movie, the latest version of Brewster's Millions, where he's just part of the gang. And just at that time, a police chief of Memphis says, oh no, it's too much fraternization, and bans the film. So I think this is a fabulous case of Orson, and Orson Welles ends up throwing himself into the middle of all of this, because he'll talk about who gets to go on USO tours, and he asks Jack Benny to do better. And so it's fascinating to see through this lens a complicated series of hopeful attempts at better race relations and integration into the US, and the complex numbers of reactions that were coming out of it. So I appreciate your interest and curiosity about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you'll make me have to write that article.
Yeah. No, you go for it. But I thought it was interesting what you said there. You were saying that a police chief banned a film. I didn't know police chiefs could ban films, or that they were.
Yeah, no, he had made himself the film censor for that segregated southern city, and it raised a huge uproar in the movie business of terrifying the studios that Eddie Anderson's appearance in a film in a relatively secondary role would get the film banned. And so what
the whole banning of things, because in our modern society that's starting to go around again, is interesting in that who's the person banning, and are they banning it because they object to it? Or are they banning it because they're getting so much pushback from a certain contingency of folks that are pushing them and they're banning it. I think the whole concept of whether you ban something or don't ban something and who bans it is just interesting topic always, to see what their thinking was at the time.
Of course, for a lot of movie makers, promoters, having been banned in Boston was something that they would take advantage of for marketing. You know, it was a badge of courage. In the case of Thelma Carpenter, I listened to a lot of her music. She was really wonderful. I often thought that she reminded me a little bit of Billie Holiday, partly because of just the sound of her voice, but also the way she interpreted songs. It was reminiscent to me of Billie Holiday. But we just can't get away from race in this country. It's been with us from the very beginning, from before we were a country. And I'm sad to say that I expect it'll be with us long after the United States is part of history, you know, assuming that we go the way of all empires someday. But in her specific case, it was just, you know, a sad reminder of this gash that we have on our national soul.
Well, and I think it's interesting how, like I said, with Bing Crosby, he was doing some of the same things, but didn't get called out for it. But I think even probably her being on other venues and things, maybe not getting called out. It's just interesting how you can do the same thing you've always done, and then somebody gets offended by it, or somebody realizes what's going on, and then they raise a stink about it, and so then it becomes an issue where you're like, okay, well, why wasn't that an issue a week before this, or why didn't that become a huge issue and ban all Black performers from being in radio or whatever? I'm always wondering what sort of started it, and then what kind of brought it down, and why, you know, who knows with these things. It's just interesting how they happen. John, you look like you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've been reading this book. It's called Jack Benny and the Golden Age of American Radio Comedy, and it talks about how
is it a good
Jack
book?
Benny was doing the same thing throughout the years, and yet the reaction to him was different over the years.
Agreed. Yeah, that author of that piece is so interesting and has some deep thoughts to share on these sorts of things. Do we even? I see that Kathy has a picture of that book behind her. What's the deal with that? Why are you interested in that book? I don't know, Kathy.
Well, the picture was given to me. They slapped it up on the wall somewhere. Our book published by UT Authors, and I was sitting next to a math book and a sociology book.
Well, Kathy is the author of that book, just for people who are still wondering. Because now that I think about it, these are not necessarily our Benny fans listening to this episode. This is our Orson fans.
Yeah.
So who knows? So anyway, it's a wonderful book by Kathy that John's referring to, and it does shed some insight and a look on this that, as Kathy was saying earlier, we don't have a lot of people giving us insight into this time frame and what was going on with the Black I don't know, history at this time frame or whatever. We seem to focus more on the 50s and the 60s and that sort of thing, but it's still interesting.
And a good point, because these Orson Welles programs become one of the best, most interesting ways to investigate that, because as John and Terry have said, trying to end racism, trying to push for civil rights was such a heartfelt and major theme of these shows. And so I'm so thrilled that you've asked us to listen to them and go through them as a way of investigating this.
Yeah, it's been terrific. I'll change our gears here a little bit, unless anybody else has anything they want to cover on this one, but I'll switch to the Bull story, because we haven't really talked about that. This story, for me, I don't want to give away the ending to it, because you guys are going to listen to that in a couple minutes, hopefully. Please listen to the Orson show. Don't just listen to our intro. It's a fun story. I like this story. The only thing I'm struck with is my feeling that story is more of a fantasy than anything else, and I doubt if that happened in reality in any way, shape, or form, uh, I would think it was a very, very rare occurrence from what we would normally see in a bullfight. But that's the only caveat I'll throw on that. Um, Anybody else have anything to share? Any
Well, he
insights
does
on the
say
bull
that
story?
that's a rare occurrence in
Yes.
the story itself. But my guess is it's something like he reads a headline like "bull spared," and then he creates this whole like he's such a storyteller. He could take that and turn it into a story like this.
Yes, yes, and it's a nice story. I mean, it's a feel good story for sure. Um, Terry, any thoughts on the bull story or?
I defer to Orson Welles.
Okay.
I was curious that he said it came from a story that he'd gotten the story from Robert J. Flaherty. And Flaherty did Nanook of the North. He was a film documentary maker of the South Seas, of Eskimos, of things like that.
Yeah.
Deeply interested in the human condition. And it's like, okay, and bulls. So
Yeah, huh? That's different. You never know with Orson Welles. Nice kidding. I mean, it could have been a story they shared at a party. That he knew that Orson was into bullfighting, and so he shares this story with Orson. Orson's like, "Oh, I'll take that and run with it." So, anyway, a great episode, very enjoyable, and then and surrounded by a number of good episodes before and after this. So Orson's commentaries throughout were so interesting, the way that they would change, and the subject, sometimes they'd be more political and then they'd be less political, and then they would change over to be more about his what was going on with Orson's professional life, his play that he was putting on, and things. I find these just to be fascinating. It's too bad we only have 1 year's worth and that's all he ever created, but at least we have it. Yes.
these are so much like today's podcasts.
Yes.
Personal reflections, as opposed to what we think of as the golden age of American radio, where everything's so polished and commercial, and there were all kinds of commentators, but they were usually talking about national news. And I think it's so interesting how Orson in these shows brings in the poetic, the personal. Like I said, that makes them seem very fresh and much like what podcasters today are doing.
Even to the point where at the beginning of this, he talks about the fact that this microphone is in his home, and you might hear the dog barking, as I don't know if you just did hear, or his daughter you might hear her crying. It was very, very personal, very much in that style of putting the listener in the place where the story is, or in this case, the commentary is being presented. You really feel like you're there.
Yeah, I agree. And that's what makes this so interesting, is how much, like you say, that they seem like a modern day podcast that he's creating. The other person that does this really well, whose podcasts are getting released now on a weekly basis, is Lucille Ball, where she interviews different folks, and sometimes she's on a backlot. She seems to be kind of all over the place, and they really feel like, oh, there's podcasts today that are almost exactly like hers, whether it's like Conan O'Brien's podcast, or whether you listen to there's a lot of comedians that are interviewing other comedians or interviewing other folks that are creating these, and to think that she was doing this back in the early 60s, and I don't think they knew exactly what to do with it or anything. So that's why it probably only lasted about a year. But today they have extra resonance, and the sound quality of them is so high, and they're recorded so well, that it just makes them seem like they were recorded yesterday for a current audience. But you get to hear folks that are long gone, that you've never heard in this context before, talking about what they're cooking, what their favorite food is for cooking, and what their hobbies are, and things, questions that you don't normally get from an interviewer necessarily. They're not always just plugging their next production. They're talking about their lives and their kids and things. And so I think that's interesting. John, looks like you're going to say
like something. The majority of podcasts, it goes for about a year, doesn't take off, and they abandon it.
Yeah. Pretty much. Can I mean it certainly happened with both of these. Yes, yes. Anyway. Well, I think we'll end with that. And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you enjoy all these Orsons. So bye, everybody.
Stay tuned for KECA's new commentary, Orson Welles.
This is Orson Welles, come to call again for a talk about people and the things they're doing all over the world. Then there's the story I promised for this week. We'll get to the story in just a minute.
First, just a word about Lear Incorporated. Lear, that's L-E-A-R, makers of Lear radios and sponsors of this program. It may be news to you that Lear has been making radios since 1930. More likely than not, you haven't heard the name Lear until recently. That's because the radios that Lear has been building for 15 years have been very special radios. Radios that were made for a very exacting purpose. They are aircraft radios, the kind of instruments that men stake the safety of their planes and their passengers upon. Today, Lear radios are in use in the air lanes all the way from Alaska to South America. This is why we say, since 1930, Lear has been the name men fly by. Now, for the first time, Lear is making home radios as well as aircraft radios. And when this kind of craftsmanship and forward thinking go into home radios, they become instruments of unusual excellence. We'll tell you more about these sets a little later. Now, Mr. Welles brings you his views and opinions on events as he sees them. The opinions are his own and do not necessarily represent the views of Lear Incorporated.
Ladies and gentlemen, my views are not necessarily represented by the sign I told you about in the ABC parking lot. You remember I mentioned that sign last week. It says, "No bailment created here," and rashly offered free radio tickets to anyone who could decode the phrase for me. Well, I spent most of this last week paying off. Your obedient servant has never had so much mail before in his life. I'm forced to one of two conclusions: that the only people who don't know what to create bailment means are me and the man who runs the parking lot, or that every living member of the Bar Association listens to this show. A solemn thought. To protect myself from distractions like that sign, I've moved this microphone all the way out to our house in Brentwood, California. And although this is still the American Broadcasting Company, I'd like you to know about the new branch studio they've opened in our living room. It'll help explain any unrehearsed sound effects we may feature from time to time, such as the merry jingle of a Cocker Spaniel's license tag, which punctuated some of our more earnest moments on the last broadcast, or the lusty wail of an 8-month-old daughter, a sound I'm expecting any time now from the nursery above. Well, I noticed in the paper there's some talk about a new naval uniform. Seems like a good idea to me. Never could understand why they made sailors' pants so wide at the bottom when they need the material so desperately up above. Eddie Cantor, as you may have heard, added somebody new to his radio show last week, Thelma Carpenter. She's a singer, and in the continuity, she's brought in as a friend of the family, not as a servant. On the air, that's a fine, fresh way of treating a Negro artist. Last night I heard somebody ask Eddie why, in his introduction, he made no mention of the fact that Miss Carpenter's colored. And I liked Eddie's answer. In my life, he said, I've introduced a lot of singers, but I've never described one of them as a white singer. It reminded me of a story about General Eisenhower in London. Before D-Day in Ike's staff, there was a British officer who was pretty stupid and pompous and got on everybody's nerves, more than some. An American colonel came to Eisenhower one day with a beef about him. I just can't get anything done, he complained, with that ignorant British blankety-blank so-and-so. I think I know the man you mean, said the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe. He's certainly the most trying and inefficient officer I've ever had to work with. He is, as you say, ignorant. You have my permission to call him a blankety-blank anytime you want to, because it's true. But you cannot call him a British blankety-blank in my presence. You may describe him as a so-and-so, but I will not tolerate your calling him a British so-and-so. Eisenhower got rid of the so-and-so, and the colonel who called him a British so-and-so was relieved of his duty and went back to the States. Speaking of Eisenhower, we saw his motion picture the other night. We have time, I'd like to tell you about it. First, a word or two about the news. We don't know yet what Ike had to say to Patton, who wants to give Bavaria back to the Nazis, apparently. We'll probably never hear the exact words, which is a shame. Old Blood and Guts has put his foot in it before. This time, my guess is he's in it way over his shiny boots, above the pearl-handled shooting irons, and right up to the well-known lacquered helmet. But the truth is, old B&G isn't the only champion of a soft peace for Germany. Many of the things we're up to in Germany and in Japan are a source of worried suspicion to our recent allies. Jimmy Burns has made the Russians particularly unhappy these last 3 weeks. And Truman's denials notwithstanding, the London Conference of Foreign Ministers is a washout. a hopeless flop. Here at home, men close to the scene are saying that the president's political honeymoon is over. Many top-flight operators who worked their hearts out for Roosevelt at low salaries are now heeding the siren song of better pay, are leaving government for business. According to them, Harry Truman's Little Man Act is wearing thin to the people who are thrown out of work and can't get unemployment insurance. The president won't be able to keep many valuable young men in government service unless he persuades them soon that he's really fighting for the program on which he and Roosevelt were elected. They don't mind a losing battle, but they do want the chance to get at least one belt in before the gong rings. And in England, in the new Labour government, the same kind of young men are grumbling about McDonaldism. Younger Labour members in the House of Commons are insisting out loud that their administration apply the basic policy on which it was elected. For Britain's Foreign Office, the two great problems today, of course, are one, India, where promised radical changes in administration have yet to be made, and two, Palestine, where, past all argument, the doors must be opened much more widely for the Jews of Europe. Domestically, of course, Britain's first problem is the need for food. Friends of mine just off the plane from England say that the British people have getting less to eat now if possible than during the Blitz. Of course, on the continent, things are immeasurably worse. Well, it seems the woman from Weehawken still thinks I'm a loony who wants to give America away to the foreigners. In her latest letter, she accuses me of wanting to feed the world. Madam, I wish I could. The world is very hungry, and hungry is a bad word. And hunger is not a symptom of peace. Madam, your government and mine promised food for starving Europe. We're not keeping our promise. With other nations, we pledged our share of food to UNRWA. But unlike other nations, we aren't honoring that pledge. What other nations, you ask? Well, Canada, for instance. Canada has just started meat rationing again to try to help stop the spread of famine abroad. Who's to blame? No individual, no group, no agency is willing to admit particular responsibility. Really, it's all of us who failed, who've fallen down. You know, we promised 4,921 tons of dried eggs. We've not yet delivered a single egg, not even a rotten one. We pledged 3,943 tons of margarine and 34,446 tons of sugar. We failed on those pledges. And if it's our fault, Madam, yours and mine, what can we do about it? Well, we can wire the White House, the Secretary of Agriculture, and our congressmen. Our congressmen aren't even talking about the matter nowadays. Seems there aren't any votes in Europe. All in all, I think you and I are being pretty poorly represented these days by the politicians we elected to Congress. The Senate, you know, is stripping the Wagner-Murray full employment bill of its meaning and all possible effectiveness. Taft claims there's no panacea to unemployment. Perhaps some of our senators are willing to see a few millions waiting in line at the soup kitchens, but the men who found jobs in wartime, and above all the men who fought in the war, won't be content to consider unemployment one of the blessings of peace. Last week, I started a story dedicated to all those who've been objecting to our references to bullfighting and who sympathize with the bull. A fighting bull is the hero of this story, and it's a true story. His name was Bonito. He grew up in a place where fighting bulls are raised, with a little boy, the son of one of the ranch hands. They spent most of their time together, these two. They were as close friends as a boy and his dog ever are. Now, if I were to tell you that my daughter was playing in the jungle with a lion or a king cobra, it would be no less remarkable than this, because no living thing is more innately vicious, more terribly dangerous, more untamable than the fighting bull. And Bonito was no weakling to all appearances. He was the superior of any of the animals bred up to that time on that famous ranch. Yet, he was like a puppy with a little boy. And as he grew, as wise and gentle as a good old horse, retired to the pastures. Well, imagine the consternation when the two were discovered together one day, the beast feeding out of the child's hand. It was believed by all that despite his handsome looks, Bonito would prove a coward. When his time came to be sent to the city for the corrida, the owner doubted little that here was an animal appointed to disgrace a proud breed. The little boy ran off in the night and followed to the place where his beloved pet must meet his death. A sad time for the little boy, you can be sure. Before the tragedy, he went to pray for the creature to whom he had given all his childish love. And there, in the chapel, kneeling at the altar beside him, the little boy saw the great matador who was to kill Bonito, or be killed by him. They prayed side by side, the boy for the bull's life, the torero for his own, then left by separate doors, The bullfighter to prepare for the paseo, to brief his quadrilla, to wait in the shadows under the arena, sweating with fear, as matadors always do, even on the coolest afternoon. The little boy to spend a last tearful moment with his friend, the big, black, wise-looking beast, waiting for death in the wooden cage. Music and the great roar of the crowd. Doors suddenly open before the bull. The hornet sting of the ranch colors spiked into the great hump of muscle on his back. A fine entrance. Here was a great bull, and the crowd knew it. The critics leaned forward in their seats. Now, a great faena is preserved for the students of the art in careful records. And to this day, we know exactly how the great bull and the great matador worked together in the blazing plaza on that historic afternoon. Every move of the cape, how Bonito charged and charged again, straight as a locomotive, noble as a hero out of Homer. But of all this, the little boy saw nothing. He could not watch. If he had tried, he would have seen nothing for the tears. Then came time for the kill. The moment of truth, the Spaniards call it. The sword was raised. Silence choked the plaza. Then, at the very last instant, the stillness was shattered by the cry of a trumpet. The executioner lowered his sword, smiling. Hand flushed with such triumph as comes in a lifetime, to few men left the arena. His adversary, still furiously alive, stood his ground under the cruel sun. Then spoke the highest authority of the corrida, addressing himself in formal tones to the victorious bull. Bonito, you are more than brave. We have seen you reaffirm the dignity and splendor of the art and of the breed. We, therefore, pardon you. Go back to the place of your birth and beget more of your kind. And so it happened, as sometimes happens, but very rarely, that for extreme bravery, a bull was spared his life. But Bonito, still blind with rage, understood no word of this, and feeling no gratitude, refused to leave the ring. They sent the cows in after him, but he turned on them, and they, poor creatures, stampeded, panicked. He had won this ground in battle, and he would not budge. Then a great gasp, a shudder of fear and outrage went up in the plaza. Somehow, a little boy had jumped into the center of the ring. Men turned their eyes away from the expected horror, but when they looked again, wonder of wonders, there was the little boy standing cool and safe beside Bonito, this phenomenon of fury, this terror among fighting bulls. And what was the child doing? Patting the head between the frightful horns. And if they'd known it, whispering words of comfort to an old friend. Amazed, they saw the great Bonito nuzzle this child like a colt, then move politely after him, like a little dog, out of the ring. And so the two went back to their ranch together, and Bonito, according to the terms of his pardon, had many brave sons. And in the fullness of time, so did his little friend. Since this story is perfectly true, I'm very glad to tell you that they both lived happily ever after. Before I leave, I'd like you to hear about an awfully good picture we saw last night, but first, your attention, please, for an interesting announcement.
Now, just a word about Lear home radios. You'll probably know why I emphasize the word home. It's because the name Lear has been known mostly for its very fine aircraft radios. Now, the kind of skill and craftsmanship that make Lear aircraft radios so outstanding is going into radios that you can buy for your home. Some models include television. Some have the wonderful Lear wire recorder. And there are record players with automatic record changers and new static-free FM and world-scanning shortwave. With so much quality and advanced engineering knowledge built into these radios, you might expect that they'd cost a lot. But that just isn't so with Lear radios. They're right along in price with radios far less distinguished. There's a table model at $19.95. And at the other end of the line, there's a beautiful console with the best of everything at $500. The more you appreciate fine reproduction, the more you'll recognize their fine performance and agree that Lear gives you the most for every dollar you spend. Remember the name Lear, L-E-A-R. And now a few words about next week.
Like you, we thought we had our fill of war commentaries, but The True Glory by Carol Reed and Garson Kanin is by so much the best that we abandoned all resistance to more battle footage and gave in to a really great experience. The True Glory. It's the Eisenhower picture. Please don't miss it. Well, now the clock tells me I must say goodbye. Please let me come to call again. And thanks for this time. Until then, speaking for my sponsors, the makers of Lear radios, and my daughter upstairs, who's been nice enough not to spoil her daddy's broadcast, I remain, as always, Obediently yours.
This is the American Broadcasting Company.
10:30 at KECA, Los Angeles. By trans.